Hello, this is Johanna Ralston of the World Obesity Federation. Thank you and welcome to everyone to our webinar today which will launch the dossier on front of pack labeling. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We've got participants from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, as well as Europe and the US. We do want to acknowledge the support of the grant from the EU Third Health Program. Thanks very much to everybody for joining today. So for today's presentation, our agenda is as follows. We'll have presentations from my colleagues here at the World Obesity Federation, followed by Dr. Chantal Julia from France, Sue Davies from WICH, and Ana Munchia from the National Institute of Public Health in Mexico. All three experts in front of pack labeling, bringing different areas of expertise to this today's webinar. In terms of general housekeeping, and just a reminder, please mute yourself and please do double check so that we don't have any background noise to today's session. Please do ask questions throughout and use the chat box for those questions. We will have time for a couple of questions between each presentation. So if you have a point that you really wanted to sort of ask the speaker about, please do type it into the chat box. A reminder, the webinar will also be recorded, so you'll be able to access it after today's session. And those are just, I think, the key issues. And we've got a very, very full agenda because we've got three world-leading experts as well as my own colleagues today, and so quite a lot of material to cover. Just a reminder in terms of the policy dossiers, this is, we've launched a number of these starting in 2018. These provide a summary of evidence and resources to help policymakers, NGOs, and others when seeking to implement a policy in their country. And so today, again, as I said at the outset, we're launching the front of pack labeling dossier that's now gone live. And you can find that as well as all the other dossiers on the website, the link that's provided here. So again, front of pack labeling is a very complex and rapidly changing area. And there's a lot of sort of best practices and legislation underway. So what we're going to learn about is different types and get an overview of the state of front pack labeling. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleagues, Margot Neveu and Leslie Viejar from the World Obesity Federation. They'll be speaking about the implementing front of pack nutrition labeling as part of the dossier.
Thank you very much, Johanna. And yes, today Margot and I are going to be talking about front of pack nutrition labeling regulation across the European Union. And we're very happy to share World Obesity Federation considerations and recommendations for different stakeholders. So first of all, since we are going to be talking for an hour about front of pack nutrition labeling, it's very important to start with definitions. So food labeling is any written, printed, or graphic matter that is present on the label, accompanies the food, or is displayed near the food, including that for the purposes of promoting itself or disposal. And the current European legal framework does not support mandatory front of pack nutrition labeling regulation. Therefore, as you can see on the map, we have across the European Union multiple government-endorsed front of pack nutrition labeling coexisting. And this lack of harmonization is for both for the format, but also for the implementations of front of pack nutrition labeling schemes. Here are some examples of front of pack nutrition labeling, and I'm not going to go to detail to them, but for example, we have the endorsement logo, and one example is the keyhole logo that was first implemented in Sweden, but also we have the nutrient-specific interpretative system, such as the multiple traffic light labeling implemented in the UK, and also the graded summary indicators, such as Nutri-score, developed in France. And
So as Leslie just mentioned, across the European Union, there is no framework that supports the implementation of mandatory front-of-pack labeling. However, we are really seeing a growing momentum from national governments to implement some sort of labeling regulations. So World Obesity has developed a briefing in which we include a number of considerations for different stakeholders to consider when they are developing nutritional labeling policies. So first of all, we really recommend the need to consider the context. So we need to consider the nutritional and the health status of the population, but also the legal framework under which these policies will be introduced. We also recommend the development and adoption of a nutrient profiling model. So labels really should be placed on products that are selected based on their nutrient composition. We also need to adopt a standardized front-of-pack labeling system. So as we have said, there is a lack of harmonization of labels across the EU. And so the adoption of a standardized front-of-pack labeling scheme would improve the impact of the tool, but also help avoid confusion among the different consumers. We also really need to use the best available evidence of efficacy, and labels should be developed based on independent scientific evidence and best practices. There's also a need to consult with the different stakeholders while ensuring that safeguarding processes are in place in order to avoid conflicts of interest. So we need to consult with academia and civil society organizations, as they can all bring very useful expertise and insights when developing policy processes on issues such as the type of label that should be used, but also which type of products the labels should be applied to. We also need to work on the dissemination and education of front-of-pack labeling. So we need to adopt the appropriate communication strategies and dissemination of the labels. And these should all be complemented and supplemented by educational campaigns in order to improve both the awareness and the understanding of the different labels. We need to also develop monitoring and evaluation framework in order to be able to assess the implementation, the impact, and the effectiveness of the different policies. And finally, front-of-pack labeling policy should be used as part of a comprehensive policy portfolio to increase both the impact of the policies, but also to encourage a multi-sectoral approach to health and nutrition policies. And so if you want more details about these recommendations, please go and take a look at our policy briefing that is now available on World Obesity Federation's website.
Thank you to Leslie and Margot for that excellent overview of front-of-pack labeling. Our next speaker is Dr. Chantal Julia, who is going to, from the University of Paris. She will be speaking about Nutri-score. Dr. Julia?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you so much for the briefing. It's very important to have this kind of document available for everyone. So I'm going to speak of the history and implementation of the Nutri-score, trying more to provide an overview not of the validation studies that have been done, but rather how it was implemented, how it worked out in France. Next slide, please. So the Nutri-score initially was proposed based on scientific literature available at the time that stated that summary labels were more efficient than nutrient-based labels, and in particular for vulnerable populations that are a target group for nutrition policies. Then the second criteria that was used for the development was that a label that could be affixed on all foods would be more efficient than a label that would be affixed only on a fraction of foods, like the most healthy foods. And the third criteria that was used, color-coded schemes would be more efficient than those including only numerical information, but not any type of color, only what we call semantic colors, meaning the green and red scale, which are readily interpretable by consumers as stop and go signs. So this led to the development of a graded color summary label that is now the Nutri-score. Next slide, please. So the Nutri-score relies on a nutrient profiling system, which was based on the Food Standard Agency Ofcom score, takes into account both favorable and unfavorable elements of a food, the energy, sugars, saturated fat, and sodium, to which 0 to 10 points are allocated, and balances these elements with positive nutrients like the amount of fruit, vegetable, nuts, and legumes, the amount of fibers or proteins, to provide an overall assessment of the nutritional quality of the food. Goes from -15 to +40 for lower nutritional quality. Adaptations were made to take into account the French context and to be able to implement the score based on front pack labeling, and adaptations were made for cheese, beverages, and fats and oils. Next slide, please. The implementation of the Nutri-score took about 3 years in the making. The first element in which the Nutri-score was proposed was in 2014 in a report by the French president of the National Nutrition and Health Program. Here you have the various types of elements that were taken into account. In red, you have all the political side, because the Nutri-score once proposed in this report was taken up into the health law of 2016. The decree was published in 2016, but the notification to the EU was only in 2017. A consultation process was put together by the French Ministry of Health, and including multiple stakeholders, including industry, consumer groups, scientists, and took about 2 years, into which it was decided to go for a large-scale experimental trial, and for which the results were available only in 2017. Expertise documents and reports were asked from ANSES and the High Council for Public Health. And during all this period, more than 30 scientific publications and validation studies by independent academic groups were published, both for the nutrient profiling system or the validation of the graphical format. So this was a very long process in the making before reaching to a consensus on the signature of the decree, the 31 of October in 2017. Next slide, please. So during the consultation process, a number of alternatives were proposed, in particular by the industry, and included the Nutri-score that was proposed by the French Ministry of Health, the SENS system that was promoted by retailers, the multiple traffic lights, a modified version of the reference intakes that was pushed by some industry manufacturers, and it was decided to provide comparative studies in order to reach a definitive conclusion on which of these labels would be the most effective in the French population, and in order to test whether they would be able to modify the purchasing behavior of consumers using the overall nutritional quality of the items in a shopping cart as the main outcome. 2 types of studies were performed: a large-scale experimentation and an experimental economy study. Next slide. Large-scale experimentation was put into 60 supermarkets, 10 for each label and 20 controls, took place in 4 regions of France during 10 weeks. The interventions was limited to 4 shelves: the fresh deli, bread, pastries, and canned prepared meals. And labeling was only voluntary, meaning that only between 63% and 86% of products were actually labels. The data that were collected were receipts from consumers directly in supermarkets. Next slide, please. The results of this large-scale experimentation showed that 3 different labels led to an improvement of the shopping cart, but the Nutri-score was considered the most effective. And more importantly, in subgroup analysis, it showed that the Nutri-score had a higher impact in subjects buying discount brands, probably subjects with lower incomes or more disadvantaged groups. And more specifically also, the Nutri-score was the only system that led to no deterioration of the nutritional quality of the shopping cart in any subgroups, meaning that for other labels, on the contrary, there was a deterioration for some subgroups, which would be a side effect that was really on the opposed direction that was expected. Next slide, please. An experimental economy study was also performed in order to confirm the studies from the results from the large-scale trial. It was put together in intervention in a controlled setting, which is a controlled and reproducible experimental food store, including 290 foods. Around 700 participants were included in this study, and they had to make up a shopping cart before and after an exposure to a label. And the same alternatives were also tested, with an additional one that was the health star rating system. The results showed that the Nutri-score was associated with the highest improvement of the nutritional quality of the shopping cart, but most importantly, the Nutri-score performed best in the household with lower incomes, while for other types of labeling, there was a deterioration of the efficiency in this particular group. Next slide, please. In terms of how the industry responded to the Nutri-score, we went from a situation of total opposition to the Nutri-score when the proposal was put in 2014. Not one single industry group was happy with the system, to a support that was gradual. In 2017, in the moment of the notification and the signature of the decree, only 6 manufacturers and retailers had agreed for the system. In 2018, already we saw a wider support with 85 companies that were included in the scheme, both large and small companies, and a large number of retailers. And in 2019, if we look today, we have the impression that the Nutri-score is regarded more as a standard in France, with the adoption of the scheme by more than 200 manufacturers and retailers, including more recently Nestlé and Carrefour, who have stated that the Nutri-score appeared as the only option for them, at least in France. Next slide, please. In terms of notoriety, the Nutri-score has a wide population support in France, with 81% overall having already heard or seen the Nutri-score, with an progressive increase between 2018 and 2019. And the purchase of products displaying the Nutri-score has largely increased, in particular in the last year, which corresponds to the moment where there have been more industry support, and packages actually now display the Nutri-score more often than in 2018, with 41% of French consumers having bought at least once a product with the Nutri-score. Next slide, please. So the signature of the Nutri-score was in October 2017. On July 2019, around 200 brands registered, and these correspond roughly to 25 to 30% market share. They include both small and large brands, and we have seen from industry a large number of strategies of reformulation based on the Nutri-score. Next slide, please. This Nutri-score is now disseminating in the EU, with countries having formally adopted the Nutri-score in Belgium, countries being currently formally adopting in the process of notifying the EU, that are Spain and Germany, and countries that are considering the Nutri-score like Switzerland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Portugal. Next slide, please. Thank you so much, and I'm available for any comments. And the next slide, perhaps. Yes, we have published a review of the studies that were performed on the Nutri-score, on the validation side of the Nutri-score, which I haven't covered in this talk. So if you are interested, please look up either this, or there is a complete list of the publication that is available on the website of the French Ministry of Health. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chantal, for that excellent presentation. We just have time for a couple of questions that have come through. The first one is, are there any data on how consumption and production of unhealthy products changed after the introduction of Nutri-score?
At the moment, we don't have any specific data. What we know is that there is also a large reformulation that is underway by all the companies that have adopted the Nutri-score. And there is a monitoring system that has been put into place in order to monitor at least the introduction of this. We have seen also a recent study by World Kantar that has tracked consumer purchase of different foods and has shown that Nutri-score A and B is currently having a larger market share, but the Nutri-score E is still the one leading growth in the sector. But there is a larger market share with an increasing growth for A and B products.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, has the Nutri-score been used anywhere else beyond labeling, i.e. to restrict advertising?
For now, no. There has been a push by some MPs to try and have the Nutri-score mandatory in advertising. The bill was it was an amendment by the opposition at the time at the parliament, and the amendment was voted, but we still need for the Senate, the second assembly in France, to take up this amendment to see where it goes. But there has been, yes, an attempt at least that we have to confirm to add the Nutri-score on advertising.
Okay, and then just to sort of reiterate, the introduction of Nutri-score seems to influence consumer behavior. There's anecdotal evidence, but it hasn't been studied extensively. Would that be appropriate? Would that be
yes?
correct?
Now we don't have large elements, but there are monitoring systems that are being put in place in order to track how consumers react to the Nutri-score.
Final question is, what do you think were success factors in that led industry to industry support and adoption of Nutri-score?
That's a very good question. I think it's a number of elements. The Nutri-score, once it was selected, was very much supported by the consumer groups, and this was reported largely in the media. And consumer groups tended to have an argument about those who don't adopt the Nutri-score probably have something to hide. So they pushed for that argument out, and I believe that this also led for the manufacturers to adopt the Nutri-score at a wider scale. And once there are enough manufacturers in a scheme, it's somehow peer pressure. If your competitor has agreed for the Nutri-score, perhaps given the consumer support and consumer group support, you may have an advantage on the market. So you need to also adopt it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chantal. That was excellent and very comprehensive. And again, these slides will be available and the recording available to everyone afterwards. There was a question about subtitles. Unfortunately, we do not have the subtitles for the speakers, but you can access the slides and recording and arrange for translation of them afterwards. So thank you very much. Our next presentation is by Sue Davies, who is Head of Consumer Protection and Food Policy at Which, and she is going to be speaking about the UK experience of front-of-pack nutrition labeling, lessons, opportunities, and barriers. Sue?
Well, thank you very much, and hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the UK scheme. Perhaps I should just explain to start with that Which is the UK consumer organisation, so we're an independent consumer organisation, and we've spent a lot of time looking at tackling the barriers to healthier eating and helping consumers have clearer information about what they're eating. In the time available, I wanted to give an overview of the evolution of the UK traffic light scheme, and then talk a bit about some of the recent research that we've done, asking people's views about traffic light labelling and other front of pack schemes, and then draw some conclusions about what the next steps need to be in a UK context. Could I have the next slide, please? So to start with, the origins of the UK scheme go back to 2004. The UK has a huge problem of obesity and diet-related disease, and around that time there was a lot of focus on the measures that needed to be implemented in order to make it easier for people to eat healthily. we called for a simpler front of pack nutrition labelling scheme, as did other public interest groups at the time. Although nutrition labelling was provided on the back of pack, that was still voluntary at the time, but was done on quite a large scale. It became clear that a lot of people didn't necessarily look at that information, or if they did use the information, they didn't necessarily understand what the levels meant. So that led to a big focus on front of pack labelling and what type of system we should have. At the time, the Food Standards Agency in the UK had responsibility for nutrition policy. And so it did a lot of testing, looking at different schemes, as did we, using hall tests to test different types of schemes on food packaging and see how it performed in terms of enabling people to identify the healthier products. That showed from looking at single traffic light schemes, multiple traffic light schemes, also looking at healthier eating logos and other options that were based around reference intakes or guideline daily amounts, that the traffic light labelling scheme worked best for most people. And what came out strongly at that time was also that people really appreciated having a breakdown of nutrients. So there was a lot of focus on reducing fat, sugar and salt levels, and many people were struggling to do that, and so they wanted that breakdown within the labelling scheme. Next slide, please. There then followed a period where quite a lot of schemes emerged onto the UK market, which wasn't very helpful for consumers because there were lots of competing schemes. So some retailers, and in the UK, the supermarkets have a large selection of own brand products. So a lot of them committed to using different schemes. Some use traffic lights, but they use slightly different versions of traffic lights, as you can see in the picture. Others, including the main manufacturers, developed a different scheme without traffic light labelling schemes, which you'll all be very familiar with, the monochrome guideline daily amount or reference intake scheme. And then some retailers used a hybrid of both of those schemes, and there were different formats in which they were presented. Next slide, please. The debate then shifted to the EU level because there was a big review of labelling legislation going on, and the food information to consumer regulations were hotly debated, and front of pack nutrition labelling was a big issue. There was a lot of focus on traffic light labelling, and BEUC, the European Consumer Organisation at that time, was calling for mandatory EU-wide traffic lights. At a time, it looked like not only would the legislation not bring in traffic lights, but it might actually restrict the use of traffic lights. But what emerged in the end was some minimum requirements in terms of back of pack and front of pack information, but the ability for national schemes to be developed subject to certain criteria where there was sufficient evidence, and for them to include additional voluntary forms of expression. This then prompted another fresh look at labelling within the UK, with the UK government consulting on what a voluntary national scheme should look like in the UK. And that led a whole swathe of the supermarkets and several large manufacturers to commit to using a traffic light scheme. The Department of Health consulted on common criteria, and then in 2013 a national scheme was launched and more manufacturers committed to use it. Next slide, please. This is what the current UK scheme looks like, and as you can see, there's three elements to it. You've got the traffic light colour coding. I'm afraid there's a mistake on the slide. The traffic light colour coding applies to fat, saturated fat, sugars and salt, but doesn't actually apply to the calories. And that indicates to people whether or not the levels are high, medium or low. And that's based on per 100 grams, but there are additional criteria included to deal with larger portion sizes, so that products that consumers would eat in large portions don't come out looking unfairly healthy. And the amount per portion of the nutrients is shown, which is based on the manufacturer's recommended portion size, which can be linked to some inconsistency to some extent. And then the percentage reference intake, which are based on the reference intakes which are set out in the EU food information regulations, showing how the amount per portion relates to the reference intake. Next slide, please. There is some flexibility of presentation. So here's some examples of how the scheme appears in different supermarkets or how it's used by different brands, but there is this overall guidance on how it should be presented. Next slide, please. But there are still some manufacturers and some significant manufacturers, including Unilever and Mondelez, but they're not the only ones, who don't use the scheme. And that is for a variety of reasons. Some of the issues that have been raised have been in relation to them being concerned that there isn't a small portion criteria. But from our point of view, we've always felt that you need to have a scheme that applies across the board and gives people an indication of whether a product has high, medium or low levels of fat, sugar and salt, regardless of how much you might be eating at the time. Next slide, please. So where does that leave us? It's difficult to be absolutely sure of the precise number, but it's estimated that over 2/3 of products in the UK now carry the traffic light scheme. Other schemes have obviously started to emerge in Europe, and as we've just heard, the Nutri-score is obviously one that has developed in prominence recently. I think since the traffic light scheme was brought in more formally in 2013, there's also been a much greater focus on free sugars through the advice that's come out from the UK's Scientific Committee on Nutrition, but also in terms of public awareness more generally. It's a very interesting time in the UK. We're about to have a general election, so that will shape government policy going forward. And we are likely to be leaving the European Union as well. The government had said that there would be a review of labelling legislation as the UK leaves the EU. We therefore conducted some new consumer research just under a year ago in order to understand where people were at and what they thought about the different schemes at the moment. And we did that asking people's opinion rather than testing preferences. And it was a sample of over 2,000 people, which is representative of the population in the UK. Next slide, please. I'll just give you a very quick run through of some of the main findings. It showed that there was very high levels of awareness of traffic lights, with 89% people aware of it. Next slide, please. When we broke down the different elements in the overall scheme, it was the traffic light element that most people said that they thought was the most helpful. Next slide, please. Colour coding was also the aspect that 9 in 10 people said that they thought was the most important element of the scheme. Next slide. 3 in 5 people, so 60%, said that they thought that the colour coding was the most important aspect. And as you can see there, most of those people aged 18 to 24 thought that the reference intake was the most important aspect, but those aged 40 plus thought that the colour coding was the most important aspect. So there was a little bit of variation depending on the groups of consumers. Next slide, please. All aspects of the scheme were seen by the majority of people to be important when we asked them, what scheme do you think other people would find most useful? Next slide, please. And we also wanted to understand whether there were differences in terms of socioeconomic group. But as you can see there, when we broke it down by social grade, there wasn't really that much difference. A slightly higher percentage in the AB group compared with the DE group, saying that they thought the traffic lights were very helpful, but generally pretty consistent across the board. Next slide, please. When we asked people about whether or not they thought that the traffic light labelling should be used across all products, you can see that a high percentage of people, 85%, thought that the scheme should be mandatory so that all manufacturers had to use it. Next slide, please. And when we asked about consistency of presentation, 80% of people wanted a more consistent presentation of the scheme. Next slide, please. We also showed people the Nutri-score scheme as well as the traffic light scheme, and asked people which scheme they thought was most useful. And as you can see, the traffic light was the one that people said that they would prefer to see. 10% said, compared with 60%, said that they would like to see the Nutri-score. And when we asked whether or not they would like to see both, that was slightly higher and went up to 31%. But I think that reflects a point I made right at the start, where I think that we found through our research that UK consumers like to see a breakdown of the nutrients rather than an overall score. And that reflects some of the recent initiatives around encouraging people to reduce salt and reduce sugar levels, for example. Next slide, please. We also asked about added sugar and reflecting where there's been quite a lot of public debate about hidden sugar in foods and how much is free sugars. It was clear that most people wanted additional information on sugar, but there wasn't necessarily a clear preference as to where they wanted that information to be provided and whether or not it should be on the back of pack or should be integrated into the front of pack scheme. So next and final slide, please. So just to draw some conclusions, I think just to say at the start, I think the whole issue of nutrition and front of pack labelling, as we've talked about, has to be seen in the context of a much wider range of measures to help people make healthier choices. We still have a huge problem of obesity and diet-related disease in the UK. Around 2/3 of the population are overweight or obese. Therefore, we think it's important to have a consistent labelling scheme which can interact with other measures so that people can have clear information and consistent information wherever they're looking. But there's also obviously a need for effective reformulation programs, and traffic light nutrition labelling has certainly helped to drive reformulation by encouraging retailers or manufacturers to look to shift more products from having a red to an amber or an amber to a green, for example. But it also needs to be seen in the context of tackling misleading claims, irresponsible food advertising and promotions as well. But the evidence from our latest research shows that specifically in relation to labelling, there is a consumer preference in the UK for the traffic light element of the scheme that we've got at the moment. There is clearly a potential to improve the presentation and to make it more consistent. People want more information about added or free sugars on the label, so that needs to be integrated. It doesn't have to be on the front, but there is an opportunity to bring that in. And I think what's really crucial is that we think that we need to have a mandatory system, because although a lot of retailers and manufacturers have got behind the scheme, it's not helpful as helpful as it could be until all manufacturers use it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sue, for that excellent presentation. We are very short on time, so I'm just going to ask you 2 questions and ask you to respond to sort of both of them at once. One is about why are we not adding a label on added sugars? This is from a nutritionist who says it's confusing for her clients around the issues of yogurt, for example. Is it added or natural sugars? And then the other is around, does traffic light labeling help to identify the healthiest product among those that are fairly similar to one another?
Yeah, I think on the added sugars point, as I've just shown, that's something that we asked about, because that is one weakness, that you just get an indication of overall sugars. I think there is scope to look at how information on added sugars can become much more prominent on the label, because people are conscious of that. I think the traffic light labelling scheme was developed looking at what were the nutrients of most significance at the time, and gives people an initial indication. It can't communicate everything about the nutritional quality of a product, and needs to be an indication that is then supported by additional information on the rest of the pack. And that's where I think there is scope to make the added or free sugars much clearer. On the second question, in terms of ability to compare between similar products, I think the traffic light labelling scheme works very well, particularly when you're dealing with highly processed products, when it can be very difficult to work out exactly how much fat or sugar or salt is in a product. And sometimes it can be quite surprising to see which is the one with more ambers or greens compared to the ones with more red and ambers. So it works very well when consumers see products side by side and can easily compare products and make choices. Because the criteria for the traffic light scheme apply across the board as well, they're not category specific. It enables consumers to make comparisons across different types of foods as well, which I think is important too.
Okay, thank you very much for that excellent response as well. We really appreciate your participating today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
And now we're going to go to our final speaker from Mexico, which is the country that's most recently been in the process of approving front of pack labeling. We have Ana Mujia, who is going to, from the National Institute of Public Health, who will be speaking about Mexico and front of pack labeling, translation of experiences and lessons to inform the development of European policies. Ana?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to talk a little bit about Mexico's experience regulating the front of pack labeling. Next slide, please. Well, first of all, Mexico is currently experiencing an epidemiological emergency because of its high rates of overweight, obesity, and diabetes. In our country, 1 in 3 children and 7 in 10 adults have obesity. Next slide, please. As we can see, sales per capita of ultra-processed products have been rising rapidly in Latin America. Mexico is the second country with the highest sales of these products. There is evidence regarding the association between the increase in sales and the increases in body weight, indicating that these products are a major driver of growing rates of overweight and obesity in the region. Next, please. Considering front-of-pack labeling in Latin America, in Mexico, we have the GDA, or the Guideline Daily Amounts, that was implemented in 2014. Ecuador approved the traffic light system in 2014, and Chile was a pioneer country who implemented the warning labeling system in 3 stages. The first one was in 2016, the second in 2018, and the last one was this year. Then Peru implemented this system in 2019, and in Uruguay it was approved in 2018, but will be applied next year. Next slide, please. So what happened with the GDA in our country? We have evidence that Mexicans don't understand this labeling. 45% of the population indicate that it's not understandable. Also, the GDA does not adequately address vulnerable population. Given that to interpret the GDA correctly, mathematical operations are needed. We also have evidence that dietitians don't understand this labeling either. According to a study in Mexican dietitians, only the 12% could interpret the GDA, and it took them more than 3 minutes to interpret it. It is necessary to consider that people take about 4 to 30 seconds to make a decision at the point of sale. So taking more than 3 minutes to interpret a front-of-pack labeling, it's unacceptable. Also, to interpret the GDA, it is necessary to know how many calories you need to consume in 1 day. And of course, it's information that most of the Mexicans don't know. Finally, the GDA was not designed by health or nutrition experts, but rather by the food industry. Next slide, please. The GDA was implemented in 2014 in the official Mexican norm 051. Then in 2016, the epidemiological emergency was declared in Mexico, and this emergency was ratified in 2018. Then, in response to this situation, a group of experts in the public health and nutrition area developed recommendations for the front-of-pack labeling, among them the use of a warning labeling system. Next slide. Well, according to our regulations, Mexican norms have to be reviewed every 5 years. So in 2019, we had the opportunity to change the GDA. So in March of this year, a technical group was created to develop a preliminary project for the norm 051. Many actors participated in this, including the National Institute of Public Health, the PAHO, UNICEF, NGOs, the Ministry of Health, and the COFEPRIS, that is our sanitation authority. And then in July, we call experts of different countries who were involved in the design, evaluation, or implementation of a warning labeling system to talk about their experience and the difficulties they face with the food industry. We had people from the World Cancer Research Fund, from Chile, Uruguay, from Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, from the PAHO, UNICEF, and they also gave us recommendations for our proposal. Next slide, please. Why did we not choose Nutri-score for Mexicans? Well, first of all, for us, it's not common to rate with letters. And according with a study done with the Mexican population, it's confused with vitamins. We also had the concern that products that are high in critical nutrients can improve their score by adding fiber or vitamins. And it is very common in our country to find unhealthy products with these added ingredients. And we need to consider all the time the critical situation that Mexico is experiencing. We need a frontal pack that most of the population could understand, because in Mexico, almost half of the population lives in poverty. The majority only has middle school education, and we have a diverse indigenous population. Next slide, please. Well, we also have national evidence. This study shows the understanding of different labeling system among Latinos and Mexicans. We found that the most understandable system was warning labeling over the nutrition fact table, the guideline daily amounts, the health star rating, and the traffic light. Next, please. Next slide. Thank you. We also studied understanding in children of low socioeconomic status, and we found that they were better able to understand and evaluate the information when they were using the warning labeling. Next. We also choose the legend excess because it has the greatest association with an unhealthy product, and the legend high in can generate positive associations, for example, high in protein or high in vitamins or maybe high in energy. Next slide, please. So this is the final Mexican warning labeling system. The proposals uses warning labels. It is based on the PAHO nutrient profile model. It uses the legend excess, declares calories for critical nutrients, and it adds 2 warnings to protect children. Next. This is our Mexican nutrient profile model. We have to add a criteria for energy and another criteria for sodium in non-caloric beverages. Next. And this is the final design. We have calories, sugar, sodium, saturated fat, trans fat, and a warning label that says contains non-caloric sweeteners, avoiding children, and a legend that says contains caffeine, avoiding children. And we developed these little labels for products smaller than 20 square centimeters, and it indicates the number of labels that violate the nutritional profile. Next. So what happened next? At the same time that we were working on the norm 051, we were fighting for the general health law to add the warning labels. So on July 24th, the general health law was approved by the Health Commission of the Chamber of Deputies. Then we passed to the next phase of the norm 051. This phase was the most difficult because the food industry was part of this working group. In these meetings, we had to reach a consensus with all the parts, but of course the food industry was against this project. Then on October 1st, the General Health Law passed to the full Chamber of Deputies. Next slide. And on October 4th, the project of the norm 051 was approved and the public consultation began. Then on October 15, the General Health Law was approved at the Health Commission in the Senate. And next slide. And finally, on October 22nd, the General Health Law was approved at the full Senate. So now it is a reality that Mexico is going to have a warning labeling system. But next slide. But all the specifications are in the norm 051. And the public consultation is still ongoing. So it is important to talk about the strategic partnership. We have the advocacy of PAHO, UNICEF, other NGOs like El Poder del Consumidor, Contrapeso. We have lobbying from other NGOs, Polythink, Salud Crítica, and all the evidence was provided by the National Institute of Public Health, and we also have the support of another national institute, the Salvador Subirán, that is the National Institute of Nutrition here in our country. And another very important thing is that we have the support of the public sector of our Ministry of Health and the COFEPRIS, that is our sanitation authority. Next. And well, so far we continue to have food industry interference. They try to delay all the process, divide with other arguments, deflect, and try to generate fear in the population. And continuously they are denying the scientific evidence. And what we do is expose their tactics and defend with scientific evidence. Next, please. So what are the recommendations for European countries? You have to use national and international evidence, develop technical groups with people from different areas. It is important to record the process, and you will need strategic partnerships with NGOs, academy, public sector, international organization. Well, in case of food industry interference, you have to expose their tactics, lobbying, and political pressure, and always defend with scientific evidence. Another very important point is that you have to encourage participation among citizens, and you need to spread information for policymakers and civil society through policy brief, videos, infographic, public conference, forums, seminars, and social media campaigns. Next. And well, this is an example of how to spread information. The first one is an advertising of an NGO, and you can find it around the city. It says, let's demand a clear labeling for our children. And also the National Institute of Public Health. We are always sharing infographics on social media for the general population. We clarify every time that food industry attacks our arguments, and we always provide evidence. There is also a popular hashtag on social media, etiquetado claro ya, that means a clear labeling now. So this is all. Thank you so much.
Anna, that was excellent. There was a couple of questions. One was around the how do you generate national evidence and to support the international evidence piece. I think we heard, for example, that in the case of Mexico, we had Nutri-score wasn't necessarily the right thing because there's a lack of appreciation for letters as the best way of grading something. It created confusion. People thought it was vitamins. At the same time, in France, that worked very well. Can you say a little bit more about what are some sort of affordable ways to generate local evidence so that you can tailor initiatives to local populations?
Yeah, well, of course, we take into account the international evidence of Chile or Uruguay because the Latino population is very similar to, of course, the Mexican population. But well, through this process, we have to generate this evidence, and we always try to choose like many characteristics that could be representative of our country. All the studies are in a population that is of low socioeconomic status, and well, we are still generating this evidence.
I have a question now for Sue. Hopefully, Sue, you're still there. There was a question about whether how does the front of pack labeling used in the UK match across to the nutrient profile model used for advertising and used as the basis for Nutri-score. So are we saying, are the cutoff points the same? Is this apples to apples essentially? But then, you know, sort of scored in different ways.
Yeah, they're two quite different schemes developed for different purposes. So the traffic light scheme, as I explained, has the breakdown of the different nutrients, and it's a threshold model. So you have thresholds set for what is high, medium, and low. So the low generally correspond with the definitions within, well, they do correspond with the definitions in the EU Nutrition and Health Claims Regulation. With the scheme that was developed for the advertising restrictions, that is, as you say, very similar to the Nutri-score scheme, where you've got a scoring system based on positive nutrients and negative nutrients, and you get an overall score. You then have a range, and you decide where you want to put that cutoff in order to determine what is a healthier product or a less healthy product, and therefore what is appropriate to be advertised. So you can't really read across them. That what underpins them is the nutrients that are considered to be of most public health significance in the UK, which were the starting point for both of those schemes, but they work in slightly different ways.
Great, thank you, very helpful. So I want to, I'm sorry, we're out of time, and so I just want to thank our speakers for excellent and very comprehensive presentations. I think they've shown us a great deal about front of pack labeling and also about the complexity and the importance of context. The role of industry both to help and to hinder, and the importance again of local relevance and research. So these slides will be available, and you can also email Margot, whose address is being put up right here. The webinar recording will be available online. And again, for our final webinar of the year, which is on city-led interventions, that will be on Wednesday, the 11th of December. So watch this space for more information about that. Again, thank you to all of our participants and our speakers for an excellent session today. Thank you.